everyone here is really heartbroken and they're really in shock. That's because Josh and Kelly Boren and their children spent time at Disneyland over the holidays. So when police responded here last night and found the family dead along with Kelly's mother, neighbors were in disbelief.
The house was quiet. No lights. No movement. No warning. Police arrived. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Doors were locked. Windows intact. Nothing stolen. No forced entry. That detail mattered. It removed one option. This was not a stranger. Families should be safe. Statistics say otherwise. Most violent deaths happen inside homes. Often by someone trusted. Often by someone familiar. The Borens were ordinary. No public conflict. No criminal record. No obvious danger. Neighbors noticed nothing. No shouting. No unusual activity. Silence became a warning. Investigators studied the scene. Positions. Order of events. Patterns emerged. This was controlled. Not random. Random crimes leave chaos. This scene did not. Family annihilation has patterns. Isolation. Pressure. Hidden conflict. Control. No evidence of a break-in. No trail. The timeline collapsed inward. Attention turned to routine. Who woke first? Who arrived home last? Who made decisions? Phones and messages were reviewed. Small details gained importance. Hidden tensions mattered. Normalized warning signs mattered. Ignored signals mattered. This case revealed failure. Not of one person, but of awareness. Of intervention. Of asking hard questions early. The victims were people. With routines. With futures. Those futures ended abruptly. Calm did not mean safety. Silence did not mean peace. Investigators closed in. One truth became unavoidable. The danger was already inside. The most important question remained. Who notices quiet warning signs first? Investigators did not rush. They slowed everything down. Rooms were examined. One by one. Nothing overturned. Nothing broken. Violence usually leaves chaos. This scene resisted it. Furniture stayed in place. Objects remained orderly. There was intention here. Time mattered. The sequence mattered. Who was where? And when? This was not a single moment. It was a process. Each action followed another. No panic. No interruption. That suggested familiarity. Comfort with the space. Knowledge of routines. Random attackers make mistakes. They rush. They react. They flee. Here there was no rush. Only completion. Entry points were rechecked. Locks were secure. Windows untouched. Still no breach. That eliminated coincidence. This was planned. Attention moved to patterns. Which room first? Which room last? Order told a story. The order suggested priority. Control over outcomes, not impulse. Family crimes often hide intent behind routine, behind normalcy. Investigators noted the quiet. No neighbors disturbed. No sudden noise. Timing was deliberate, chosen carefully, to avoid attention. This was not about escape. There was no escape plan. This was about finality. When violence aims outward, it leaves traces. When it aims inward, it closes in. The house itself became evidence. Walls that knew the people. Rooms that held habits. This was not just a location. It was a system. And someone understood it fully. As details aligned, one idea grew stronger. The scene was not staged to confuse. It was staged to finish. And that raised a deeper concern. If this was planned so carefully, what happened long before this night? Investigators listed every key, every code, every routine. Access became the focus. This house was not open. It was familiar. It was controlled. Only a few people moved freely here. Only a few knew the schedules. Who woke up first? Who left last? Who stayed behind? Daily habits mattered. Morning patterns. Night routines. Unquestioned normal behavior. Trust creates blind spots. Families depend on it. Crimes exploit it. No neighbors reported strangers. No unfamiliar vehicles. No unusual visits. That narrowed the circle. Quickly. Uncomfortably. Investigators studied relationships. Not arguments. Not rumors. But power. Who made decisions? Who set rules? Who adjusted plans for others? Control does not always look violent. Sometimes it looks responsible. Sometimes it looks normal. Family annihilation rarely begins with rage. It begins with entitlement. The belief that outcomes belong to one person. Access is not just physical. It is emotional, psychological, routine-based. Phones revealed patterns. Who checked in? Who did not? Who stopped responding? Silences became louder than messages. Financial records were reviewed. Not for theft. For pressure. For dependency. Pressure creates corners. Corners create dangerous thinking. Investigators asked a simple question. Who benefited from control? And who suffered under it? This was not about opportunity. Opportunity was everywhere. This was about permission. Permission granted by trust. By routine. By proximity. The house did not resist the intruder. Because it did not recognize one. As the circle tightened, one reality became harder to ignore. The person with the most access also had the most to lose. And that led investigators to a final concern. What happens when control feels like it is slipping away? Early conclusions form quickly. Sometimes too quickly. Investigators assumed urgency. They assumed panic. They assumed desperation. The scene did not support that. No frantic movement. No rushed decisions. No visible mistakes. That contradiction mattered. The first assumption was simple. That violence erupted suddenly. That something snapped. But nothing here suggested loss of control. Family cases are often misread. Because familiarity feels harmless. Because routine feels safe. Investigators initially searched for triggers. A fight. A crisis. A final argument. They found none. No recent disturbances. No emergency calls. No warnings reported. That absence created comfort. And comfort delayed scrutiny. Patterns were present. But they were quiet. And quiet patterns are easy to dismiss. Control was mistaken for calm. Order was mistaken for peace. That was the error. Family annihilation rarely explodes. It tightens. Slowly. Deliberately. Pressure builds in silence. Not noise. By assuming suddenness. Investigators overlooked duration. They asked what happened at night, instead of what had been happening for months. That delay mattered. Witness timelines were accepted too easily. Routine explanations were not challenged. Normal answers felt sufficient. They were not. The case did not fail. But it drifted. Just long enough. And drift costs time. Time costs clarity. Eventually the assumptions were questioned. Eventually the lens shifted. But by then, critical hours had passed. The crime scene had been controlled. Long before police arrived. Long before the night itself. And that realization forced a rethink. If this was not sudden, if this was not reactive, then how long had this been forming? Before the crime, there was a picture. It looked ordinary. Family photos showed stability. Routine smiles. Normal milestones. To outsiders, the Borens were quiet, private, unremarkable. No police visits. No public disputes. No visible crisis. Friends described them as normal. Co-workers saw no warning signs. Neighbors noticed consistency. Consistency creates trust. Trust lowers suspicion. Schedules were predictable. Lives appeared structured. Nothing felt out of place. This image mattered. Because it shaped assumptions. When families look stable, concerns feel intrusive. Questions feel unnecessary. People avoid probing. They respect boundaries. They move on. Public calm often hides private pressure. But pressure is invisible from a distance. Social appearances reward silence. Problems stay internal. Image stays intact. The Borens did not seek attention. They did not signal distress. They did not ask for help. That absence was misread. As proof of stability. As proof of safety. Investigators reviewed history. Work records. School routines. Community involvement. Nothing stood out. That was the problem. Danger rarely announces itself. It blends in. It waits. The stronger the image, the less likely intervention becomes. Normal becomes a shield. Privacy becomes a barrier. This case showed how easily danger hides. Not behind chaos, but behind routine. As the investigation widened, one realization became clear. The public image told a story, but it was not the full one. And that raised a critical question. What was happening behind closed doors? Behind closed doors, patterns change. Public calm does not erase private strain. It often conceals it. Daily life creates friction. Small compromises, repeated sacrifices, unspoken resentment. In the Boren household, control shaped routine. Decisions followed one direction. Plans adjusted for one person. Others adapted quietly. This did not look like conflict. It looked like order. Order can hide imbalance. Balance requires voice. Silence removes it. Tension rarely appears as shouting. It appears as compliance, as avoidance, as emotional withdrawal. Investigators searched for arguments. They missed the quieter signs. Who interrupted whom? Who decided schedules? Who carried emotional weight? Private pressure builds slowly. It normalizes itself until it feels permanent. Family members learn patterns. What to say, what not to say, when to stay quiet. That adaptation mattered, because it reduced resistance. Control thrives in predictability, and predictability was everywhere. No record showed violence. That absence misled many. Psychological dominance leaves no bruises, but it shapes behavior. Stress compounds in closed systems. Without release, without challenge. People outside saw stability. Inside, tension accumulated. This was not chaos. It was compression. Compression narrows choices. Narrow choices increase risk. Investigators later recognized the signs. Too late to prevent. Early enough to explain. The household did not feel unsafe. It felt constrained. And constraint changes thinking. As pressure tightened, options began to feel limited. And that led to a dangerous shift. When silence becomes survival. What happens when it finally breaks? Warning signs rarely announce themselves. They blend into routine. In this family, concerns were subtle, easy to dismiss. Behavior changed slowly. So slowly it felt normal. Withdrawal replaced conversation. Compliance replaced discussion. Silence replaced disagreement. These shifts did not trigger alarms. They were explained away. Stress was blamed on work. Fatigue was blamed on routine. Distance was blamed on time. Each explanation reduced urgency. People around the family noticed small things. Less social contact. Fewer shared plans. Shorter conversations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing reportable. That was the problem. Warning signs that are quiet, are easy to excuse. Control was framed as responsibility. Decisions were framed as leadership. Restrictions were framed as protection. Language matters. It can disguise harm. Those affected adjusted their behavior to avoid conflict, to maintain peace. Peace became the priority, not honesty, not balance. When discomfort becomes routine, it stops being questioned. No one called for help, because nothing seemed broken. But systems fail before they collapse. Families do too. Investigators later reconstructed moments, missed opportunities, conversations that never happened, a question unasked, a concern unspoken, a boundary never enforced. Each omission reduced visibility. Each silence increased isolation. Isolation is dangerous. It removes external correction. By the time patterns were clear, the window for intervention had closed. The warning signs were present. They were simply normalized. And normalization carries consequences. This case showed how danger grows. Not through chaos, but through acceptance. As pressure continued to build, one final change began to appear. When ignored warning signs stop whispering, what do they become? Pressure does not explode. It compresses. Over time, options feel fewer. Outcomes feel fixed. In this household, choices narrowed quietly. Routine became rigid. Flexibility disappeared. Control tightened. Small decisions stopped being shared. They were assigned. Resistance felt pointless. Compliance felt safer. That shift mattered. When people feel trapped, they stop negotiating. They start enduring. Endurance has limits. Investigators later traced timelines. Not to a single event, but to accumulation. Days without relief. Weeks without challenge. Months without balance. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the danger. The absence of crisis created denial. Denial delayed action. Stress distorted thinking. Problems felt permanent. Solutions felt unreachable. This is where risk escalates. When imagination collapses. Family annihilation does not begin with violence. It begins with fatal conclusions. The belief that control must be absolute. That outcomes must be final. That alternatives no longer exist. That belief forms quietly. Without witnesses. No one intervened here. Because nothing looked urgent. But urgency had already passed. The system was closed. The pressure sealed inside. At this stage, external help feels threatening, not supportive. Investigators recognize this pattern later. Too late to interrupt. Early enough to understand. The point of no return is rarely visible, until it has already been crossed. And once crossed, reversal becomes unlikely. This case did not hinge on a moment. It hinged on a mindset. And that realization shifted the investigation forward. Because if the decision was made long before, then the truth would be found in the past. And that raised a critical question. What evidence remains when intent forms in silence? At first, the focus stayed external. Investigators searched for an intruder, a stranger, a threat from outside. That theory weakened quickly. No forced entry. No witnesses. No escape route. Each fact pushed the lens inward. Timelines were re-examined. Assumptions were challenged. Comfort was removed from the analysis. Routine explanations stopped working. Statements were compared. Not for emotion. For consistency. Small contradictions appeared. Minor at first. Then repeated. Repetition matters. Truth does not change shape. Behavior after the discovery was noted. What was said? What was avoided? What felt rehearsed? Grief has patterns. So does deception. Investigators did not look for tears. They looked for control. Who guided conversations? Who redirected questions? Who filled silence too quickly? Control after a crime mirrors control before it. Digital records became critical. Location data. Call logs. Gaps in activity. Silence appeared where activity should have been. That absence spoke loudly. External suspects were quietly dismissed. Not announced. Just removed. The case narrowed. The circle tightened. This was no longer about who could enter the home. It was about who lived inside it. Family cases demand precision. Emotion clouds judgment. Structure restores clarity. Investigators shifted tactics. They slowed interviews. They let silence stretch. People reveal more when not interrupted. As pressure returned inward, one truth became unavoidable. The answers would not be found outside this family. They would be found in behavior. And that led to the most dangerous realization yet. When suspicion points inward, who breaks first? Timelines became the battlefield. Every minute was mapped. Every movement logged. Every claim tested. At first, the story sounded simple. Too simple. People described routine. Normal wake times. Normal departures. Normal returns. Normal does not explain gaps. Investigators compared accounts. Side by side. Line by line. Small differences appeared. Not dramatic. But persistent. A time remembered differently. An action placed earlier. A delay explained vaguely. Memory bends under pressure. But facts do not. Digital records were checked. Phones. Signals. Location data. Devices told quieter stories. Stories without intention. A phone inactive during a key window. A message sent later than claimed. A movement that did not match words. These were not accidents. They were inconsistencies. When lies are large, they collapse quickly. When they are small, they repeat. Investigators return to interviews. Not to accuse. To listen again. Questions were reordered. Pauses were allowed. Silence did the work. Answers shifted slightly. Then shifted again. Each shift reduced credibility. People telling the truth correct themselves. People hiding something adjust. Adjustments followed pressure. Pressure followed evidence. No single contradiction proved guilt. But patterns formed. Patterns matter more than moments. Timelines no longer aligned. Not internally. Not externally. What someone said. What someone did. What data showed. Three versions cannot all be true. As contradictions stacked. Stress leaked through control. Defensiveness replaced cooperation. Precision replaced emotion. That change was noted. Because behavior under scrutiny reveals priorities. At this stage, investigators were no longer asking what happened. They were asking why stories kept changing. And one conclusion grew unavoidable. Someone was managing the narrative. And that raised a deeper question. What was so important that it needed? Evidence does not speak alone. People do. Investigators focused on behavior. Not emotion. Not appearance. Behavior under pressure matters most. Some reactions felt delayed. Others felt controlled. Too measured. Too precise. Grief is inconsistent. It interrupts itself. Control tries to smooth it. That difference stood out. Eye contact was calculated. Pauses felt timed. Responses arrived before questions finished. These are not proof. They are indicators. Investigators noted posture. Movement. Tone changes. Stress leaked through discipline. Certain topics triggered tension. Other topics brought relief. Relief arrived too quickly. Avoidance became visible. Questions were redirected. Details were minimized. Control returned whenever uncertainty appeared. This pattern repeated. Across interviews. Across days. People telling the truth search memory. People hiding intent manage exposure. Language shifted. From shared experience. To distance. Words like we disappeared. Words like I increased. That separation mattered. Investigators compared early interviews to later ones. Confidence rose. Accuracy did not. Confidence without clarity is a warning sign. Behavior before the crime was reviewed again. Decision-making. Authority. Response to challenge. The same control appeared. Before and after. Consistency across time matters. This was no emotional collapse. It was maintenance. Maintenance of image. Maintenance of narrative. Maintenance of control. That realization changed the approach. Because if control was the core behavior, then pressure would expose limits. Investigators adjusted strategy. They waited. They watched. And eventually, control began to slip. And that led to the moment they were waiting for. What happens when control can no longer hold? Pressure works slowly. Then suddenly. Investigators did not force it. They allowed it. Interviews became longer. Silences became heavier. Control had to work harder. Questions stayed simple. Repetition did the damage. The same details were revisited. Days apart. Weeks apart. Consistency failed. Small corrections appeared. Then justifications. Then irritation. Irritation is not guilt. But it signals strain. Strain exposes limits. One contradiction was addressed directly. Not aggressively. Calmly. There was no denial. Only explanation. Explanation expanded. Then overreached. Too much detail emerged. Unprompted. Unnecessary. That shift mattered. Truth answers questions. Deception fills space. Body language changed. Posture tightened. Breathing altered. Control was no longer effortless. Investigators paused. They let the moment stretch. Silence forces decisions. Speak or sit with it. Speech came first. Words were chosen carefully. Then corrected. Then reframed. Each adjustment weakened the structure. The narrative bent. Not enough to collapse. Enough to crack. Investigators introduced evidence. Not all of it. Just enough. The reaction was immediate. Focus shifted. Deflection appeared. Responsibility blurred. That was the break. Not a confession. Not an admission. A loss of dominance. From this point, the investigation had direction. And momentum. Control had defined the case. Now its absence did. The remaining steps were procedural. Methodical. Inevitable. But one question still lingered. When control finally breaks, what does the truth rush to protect? From this point, the case was no longer uncertain. Evidence was organized. Timelines were finalized. Contradictions were resolved. Process replaced speculation. Accountability does not arrive dramatically. It arrives systematically. Statements were locked. Records were preserved. Procedures were followed. There was no rush. Only precision. The legal system does not seek emotion. It seeks proof. Actions were weighed. Decisions were examined. Intent was reconstructed. Responsibility was no longer abstract. It had shape. It had sequence. This was not about one bad moment. It was about repeated choices. Each choice narrowed outcomes. Each decision carried consequence. The investigation showed intent, not impulse. Planning, not panic. That distinction mattered. Accountability requires clarity. Clarity requires patience. Charges are not punishment. They are acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of harm. Acknowledgement of loss. Acknowledgement of failure. The victims were named. Individually. Carefully. They were not evidence. They were lives. Court processes moved forward. Quietly. Without spectacle. Justice is not entertainment. It is responsibility. The case forced recognition. That control can become destructive. That silence can enable harm. Accountability does not restore lives, but it draws a boundary. A line that says, "This was wrong, and it mattered." Yet accountability alone is incomplete, because responsibility does not stop with one person. And that raises the next question. Who else failed before this point? Cases like this do not exist in isolation. They move through systems. Systems meant to notice, meant to question, meant to intervene. Here, those systems stayed quiet. No reports were filed. No concerns escalated. No reviews triggered. Silence passed through institutions unchecked. Workplaces saw stress, but framed it as pressure. Schools saw changes, but framed them as phases. Healthcare saw strain, but treated symptoms, not context. Each system acted independently. No one connected patterns. That fragmentation mattered. Institutions rely on thresholds. Clear danger. Visible harm. Quiet deterioration does not meet thresholds. Until it is too late. Privacy policies blocked curiosity. Professional boundaries discouraged probing. Doing nothing felt safer than asking. This was not negligence. It was normalization. Warning signs were distributed, so no one felt responsible. Shared responsibility dissolved into none. Protocols prioritized reaction, not prevention. By the time action was justified, the outcome was fixed. Investigators later reviewed interactions, notes, reports, missed intersections. The signs were there, but scattered. This case showed a weakness, not of individuals, but of structure. Systems see events, not trajectories. They respond to crises, not slow compression. Institutional failure is rarely malicious. It is passive, and passivity has consequences. Understanding this matters, because prevention lives here, not in punishment. As accountability widened, one final issue remained. If systems failed silently, what can stop the next case from forming the same way? This case ends, but the pattern does not. Family annihilation is not sudden. It is constructed, built from silence, from control, from unchallenged authority. The warning signs were not invisible. They were minimized. Normal was trusted. Routine was defended. Privacy was protected. At the cost of awareness. This case teaches restraint is not safety. Calm is not balance. Silence is not peace. Healthy systems allow friction. They allow questions. They allow interruption. Control without challenge becomes dangerous. Families need outside reference points. Friends. Colleagues. Institutions that compare patterns. Isolation accelerates harm. Connection slows it. Intervention does not require certainty. It requires curiosity. Asking is not accusation. Noticing is not betrayal. This case reminds us, prevention happens early, quietly, without drama. It happens when discomfort is taken seriously, when power is questioned, when silence is broken responsibly. The victims deserve visibility. Before the crime, not after. Their lives were not lessons, but their absence became one. This case does not ask for fear. It asks for awareness. Because the most dangerous situations do not look violent. They look normal. And the final responsibility rests with all of us. To notice patterns. To ask harder questions. To intervene sooner. Before control tightens. Before options collapse. Before silence becomes irreversible. So the question remains. When warning signs appear quietly, will we recognize them as danger?